the really interesting things about this console generation that nobody else is talking about is just how big of a failure the PS5 actually has been. Sony's releasing statements saying that like it's their most successful console ever, but much like the PS2 sales numbers, this is clearly false. Developers are going bankrupt, they're struggling, they're always talking about raising game prices. There's just nowhere for the industry to turn except for Nintendo consoles. Like PlayStation releasing their games on Steam is proof positive that the company is struggling to remain relevant, that nobody cares about their games, and that they are having an extremely hard time competing in this Nintendo dominated industry. And I've been talking about this for a long time. It's been very apparent to me for years, but I think this is like the go-to like big example of like what I'm talking about and just how PlayStation's traditional methods don't work anymore. This is like a really good example of just how badly PlayStation has been fucked by Nintendo and Mario and friends, right? It's just crazy that this has happened, and we are in the early stages of this being like a meme, but it really is true. Capcom's Pragmata, their big new IP that they've been developing the entire PlayStation generation, the game that's been hyped up as one of the big major draws for PS5, one of like the big new gaming IPs, the big new gaming IP coming for PlayStation. We knew nothing about it. This was like something that was coming out. We just had some vague trailers and some like images of some little girl, right? That's all we knew about. That's all we knew about Pragmata for a very, very long time. And we have spent about 5 years now waiting for this thing to come out, to learn more about it. And now it's coming out next year. We saw a trailer. Genuinely looks good. I said that, like, it actually seems, like, reasonably well made and interesting with, like, the mechanics and how it just seems to be, like, a better Last of Us, right? That's kind of my mentality towards it is, like, the whole father-daughter thing, better Last of Us. I was, like, genuinely, like, fairly interested in this game and was going to pick it up when it launched on a real gaming platform, a Nintendo console. But, like, I've come to realize, after the release of Donkey Kong Bonanza, just how badly Nintendo has wrecked Pragmata's core concept. The whole big guy, little girl dynamic, the whole, like, protecting a little girl on this adventure or whatever. Like, Bonanza has completely stomped this dynamic. The Last of Us did not do it better. Pragmata will not do it better. Yakuza will not do it better. Like, it's been very apparent, going into this, just how popular Pauline and Donkey Kong are going to be for this game. That's very clearly demonstrable, just how popular the characters are and just how they just nail like the vibe to this game to just create this really unique, interesting dynamic that just oozes style and just really complements like not only the game itself but like the brand as a whole, right? This is the next generation Donkey Kong we've been waiting for decades now, and the fact of the matter is this game is likely, going by like my estimates, going to sell like upwards of 20 million units, right? It is going to be phenomenally successful, and I think it is safe to say that it is 100% going to bury Pragmata. It took its lunch and just like, I don't know, like went home and just emptied out the fridge or whatever. Like, again, it's like, what does Pragmata do that's better than DK? Like, yeah, it has like the little girl on the back, it's the exact same thing, but like it doesn't have any creativity, it doesn't have any style, it doesn't have any like meaning to it, right? Like Pragmata is just doesn't have the same kind of soul or level of quality that Bonanza had. And that's very apparent just by watching the trailers. And a lot of people will like dispute this and kind of like condemn this, but like the reality is Donkey Kong Bonanza is a far better produced product than Pragmata. It is a completely unique IP. It is a completely unique like new take on the character and like the lore of like Donkey Kong and like the history of the brand. Like there is really nothing else like Odyssey. This is like Bonanza. This is our new big budget Nintendo 3D platformer, and it far surpasses what Capcom has done with any of their projects. Monster Hunter Wilds, Dragon's Dogma 2, and now this Pragmata. The characters are just so much more instantly likable and iconic. It's just so far beyond like what Pragmata does, where I'm 90% sure like the vast majority of the people who are like into the game are like weirdos like Mr. Medicare who like obsess over lollipop. Like, that's kind of my view of like Pragmata, but like Pauline definitely feels like more like an actual character. Like that's kind of my mindset, going into this and talking about this situation that like, Donkey Kong is an actual game. Pauline is an actual character. They actually have a real unique dynamic that actually far surpasses, not only its competition in the gaming sphere, but the Disney dynamics that probably influenced it to a certain extent. It is phenomenal seeing this play out and seeing how this situation develops, how this game is going to turn out, and it's going to be like amazing, like finally seeing like the naysayers like take the knee, because there are still a handful of people out there who are trying to tell you that like Donkey Kong isn't an A-list franchise and this game isn't going to do well and that it's going to be disappointing. Yeah, there's definitely like a lot of that in the community right now, but I think it's safe to say at this stage that like this is the same level of coping as like the Mario Kart World thing, if not more so. It is very, very difficult to try and pretend something like this isn't appealing to longtime Donkey Kong fans. And I do think this is like the heart of like Pretendo arguments, is this idea that like what Nintendo does now is not nearly as good as what they were producing in like the NES days, and with Donkey Kong, it's so clearly going to be one of the best games of the decade, if not ever made. That like I find it very, very difficult to believe that anybody could deny it, and that it's going to be one of those games. And I do think like long term, this is 100% going to overshadow The Last of Us. Donkey Kong is going to appear in more Mario movies, which will outperform The Last of Us HBO. You're going to see these characters be iconic and relevant for decades probably. Like they are like video game icons, I think, at this stage, and nothing PlayStation has ever done has ever really come close to that. And that is going to be like the grim reality that people have to face over the next several decades. That nothing that they've done to prop up PlayStation will stick. People will forget about CJ. They will forget about Trevor. They will forget about like, I don't know, like Fat Princess or whatever. Raiden. Metal Gear is becoming less and less popular all the time. There's all these like signs that like all these major PlayStation icons are not really are either becoming irrelevant or are no longer affiliated with the brand. Like I know a lot of people who first played Final Fantasy on Nintendo consoles, and it seems so strange, seeing how Square has put their best foot forward on PlayStation for decades, but like, a lot of people got into this stuff by playing old games on Game Boy. A lot of people got into this stuff by playing like older consoles or like older games or having these crazy experiences. Like PlayStation PlayStation has completely failed to create a brand. And that's like the big major takeaway we have when it comes to this current situation, is that like PlayStation doesn't have a brand. They are not successful. They can't invent like crazy new IPs. They can't reinvent new ones. That has become increasingly obvious over the past decade. Donkey Kong Country is a game that a lot of people wrote off as being stagnant and boring in the 90s, right? This idea of like the franchise being rebooted was not something that like anybody thought about or wanted to see happen. And now that it has, it's very clear that like Nintendo has something special, and it's just not something that The Last of Us will ever be able to replicate.